Just the two of us so far. Oh, here's Penny.
Hey, Ray.
Hello.
God, the dog knows.
She does.
Okay, come over here. Here, come here. All right. Oh, gosh. Oh, hello. Okay, now you can go away. Can you go?
Poor animal.
Yeah. Mitch, I have to tell you that Deanna sent me, and only Deanna would find this. It's called the Bible Project, and it was the book of Job in, well, I wouldn't say cartoon form, but drawing. The two guys did a decent job of laying out the whole book, but they do little drawings. They show Job with sores all over him and all of this.
Oh, actually,
I should send it to you. It's kind of cute. It only takes 10 minutes. You can go through the whole book in 10 minutes.
sounds like a kid's. It sounds like a very depressing children's book.
Yes, actually, I don't think it would appeal. It's in it. First of all, it's in black and white, and second, but the drawings were a nice touch.
Well, actually, just to follow on that comment, I don't know if anybody's ever heard there was an English engraver, author, poet named William Blake.
Yes.
Yeah.
And one of the things he produced was a whole series of engravings of the Book of Job.
Oh, geez.
And let's see, I'll share the screen here. There we are. So they have a set at the Met. So can everybody see that?
Yeah.
That is Job being smote with boils that's Satan over him. And if you can, he's pouring out the boils on the Job here. And so basically Blake did engravings of the major episodes in the book. And then let's see, this one I like. So this one is Job and his so-called friends. Saying, you're basically accusing him. And so you've got the three friends over here, Job in the middle, and this is Mrs. Job over here.
I'll have to say the drawings from the other thing that Deanna sent were a little more pleasant.
I guess I would have to see that, how somebody would make the Job pleasant.
Well, I'll send it to you.
Yeah. So, and one more here, let's see where here it is. So when you get to the end, this is God answering Job out of the whirlwind.
Beautiful art.
Yeah, they're actually they're quite stunning. I've always liked to use them.
Were these woodcuts or were these drawings or
These were engravings.
engravings? Okay.
Yeah, that Blake did. And as they have a set at the Met, and they're easy enough to find. If you look up William Blake and Job on, you can find copies of them. So so anyways. So, but unfortunately, when you try to meld two courses together, it's easy to get confused. And it's easier for me to get confused because I'm easily confused. So the problem is that in creating the schedule, I missed the lecture that precedes the one on Job by Cohen. So in order to keep things in the proper order, we're going to see that tonight, and then we'll see Cohen on Job next week. So this is his introduction to Ketuvim, or the wisdom literature. Keep in mind there's three parts. There's the Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim. So, and actually that works out to be an acronym for the Hebrew Bible is called the Tanakh. The part about clearing your throat is optional. So that's what we have tonight. And then next week we will do Job, and then we'll take a break for the summer.
So this week and next week are going to be Professor Cohen?
Yeah. And this will start on, if you have the notes for his lectures in front of you, it starts on the second set, page 25 of 41.
Let's see, we gotta find that.
So,
Wait a minute, which?
you find it, Dave?
No, which one was that? What's the title on that one?
Ketuvim, Wisdom, Literature, and Psalms.
Oh, wait. Oh, no, I got Job and I got the.
It's the one right before Job. Next week
Um,
is Ecclesiastes and Job.
Yeah, but I was just looking to, I've got like 30 titles here in one folder, and I'm not, they're not necessarily in order.
This is lecture 20.
Oh, okay, let me see. I can't see the end of them. Hold on. 20, 20, 20, there's 30. 12, 12, 12. I may not have that one in this folder. That's okay.
Okay. So,
19.
so that's where we stand. Anything? Any questions? Okay. No, hearing none.
Everybody is there. Okay.
Yeah, everybody's quiet and eager to learn. So I'm going to mute everybody.
That's fine.
Whoops. We've got Dale. Got her just in time. Hello, Dale.
Hello, how's everybody?
Good. How are you?
Good, good. Hope you had a safe trip.
Everything went well. It was uneventful.
Good, good, good.
Yep. So, so we're just about to start. So I'm going to be muting everybody here, and we'll be off to the races.
Okie dokie.
Share screen. Share sound.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. This is session number 20, devoted to Ketuvim, wisdom literature, and the Book of Psalms. This is a replacement lecture for the one that I should have delivered during the course time, but I was away that day, and my three very able TFs stepped forward, prepared a lecture handout, and gave a lecture. For the sake of uniformity in this whole series,
Okay, so there's no picture, so let me figure this out. Sorry. Okay, so let's try this again. Here we are. Found it. Sorry.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. This is session number 20, devoted to Ketuvim, wisdom literature, and the Book of Psalms. This is a replacement lecture for the one that I should have delivered during the course time, but I was away that day, and my three very able TFs stepped forward, prepared a lecture handout, and gave a lecture. For the sake of uniformity in this whole series, I am going to give this lecture myself now, but I freely acknowledge that I have availed myself of the lecture notes and the erudition of my three TFs. So Eric Fredrickson, Jonathan Miller, Matthew Rasur, thank you much for your help. Today we turn to the third part of the Hebrew Bible, known in Hebrew as Ketuvim, known in English as the Sacred Writings, and sometimes we see the Greek name for it, Hagiographer, which is simply Greek for sacred writings. In the Hebrew Bible, there are 11 books in this collection, and they are very varied in genre, style, theme. It is not really a uniform collection at all. It is sort of a hodgepodge of things. In the Hebrew Bible, these 11 books are, first, the big three, Psalms, Proverbs, Job. Then a collection of five scrolls, they're sometimes called, a collection of 5 scrolls that are small books that have a liturgical function in the synagogue. And then we have sort of leftovers, the Book of Chronicles, the Book of Ezra-Nehemiah, and the Book of Daniel. As a slight reminder, let's look briefly at the parallel Jewish and Christian arrangements of the Hebrew Bible, just to make sure we know where we are. So on the Jewish side, we have a tripartite Bible, right? First was the law, the Torah, then was Nevi'im, the prophets, and third of all is Ketuvim, or the writings. The middle part, the prophets, you recall, is divided in two. The first half of the prophets are historical books, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, and the second part of the prophets are, well, the prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the 12. That's the Jewish arrangement of the scriptures of the Hebrew Bible. The Christian canon is arranged differently. So in the Christian canon, you don't find a category called sacred writings. The Christian canon is not tripartite, it is quadripartite. It has 4 parts, and they are the law, parallel to the Jewish Torah, the law, historical books, roughly parallel to the first half of the Hebrew prophetic books, the books Joshua through Kings. Then we have hymns, songs, poetry, we might say. And last of all are the prophets. So if you look at the books of the Jewish Hagiographer, the Jewish sacred writings, we will find them scattered in different places in the Christian canon. So the historical books of the Christian canon will include the book of Ruth, which is an appendix to the book of Judges. And the historical books will include the books of Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, and also the book of Esther, books that are written in historical form. What we call the wisdom literature books, and I'll come back to that category very soon, Psalms, Jobs, and Proverbs, they're all included in the poetry section, along with Ecclesiastes and the Song of Songs. And last of all, the prophets will include the book of Lamentations, an appendix to the book of Jeremiah, and most importantly, the book of Daniel, So, just to make things clear, the Hebrew Bible of the Jews and the Christian Old Testament have the same books, but they are arranged differently. The table of contents is different. If you open the books and read them, they will be almost exactly the same, except that the Jews read theirs in the Hebrew version, and the Christians read theirs in Greek and Latin, and then translate it into multiple languages. So the books are the same, the order is different, table of contents is different. Why this should be so has been the subject of endless speculation among scholars as to figure out, did the Jewish canon come first and the Christian canon come later, or the other way around? Most modern scholars think that the Jewish arrangement is the earlier one and the Christian arrangement is the later one, but more important to me than knowing which is earlier or later is simply the idea that they are different, right? The Christian arrangement has its own logic, which is different from the Jewish arrangement, and if we can go by the criterion of logic, we must in fact concede that the Jewish arrangement of the sacred writings has no logic. It is just a grab bag of things, an anthology of this and that, whereas the Christian arrangement at least has some thematic or formal elements that unite these various books into these discrete categories. So that's what we're looking at today. So overview of Ketuvim, overview of the sacred writings, these 11 books. Unfortunately for us, we don't have enough sessions in our course to devote the appropriate time and attention to each of these books. So we'll be devoting some attention to select number of these books, and even within these we'll be focusing on various select chapters or themes. In a more perfect world, we would have more time to spend on all of these books, because surely they all deserve loving attention. But alas, we will have to move along. Among these books that we're going to skip, there is one which is too important to skip, and that is the Song of Songs. So I'm going to talk about it very briefly here, simply because it's just too extraordinary to omit. What is the Song of Songs? In Hebrew, Shir HaShirim. To the ill-tutored reader, the Song of Songs appears to be a collection of love songs. He sings about her, she sings about him. The two together perhaps talk about the wonders of love and the powers of attraction. And all of this is studded with beautiful imagery drawn from nature, fawns by the brook, and verdant fields, and ripe apples, and the rest, and flowing milk, and the rest. The first line of the poem suggested to ancient readers that the author of this song was none other than King Solomon himself, son of David, builder of the temple, and king extraordinaire, as described in the Book of Kings. So, ancient readers read this collection of love songs, just as we do, and ancient readers, like modern readers, are stunned to discover this collection of love poetry, some of it slightly erotic, in the pages of sacred writ. So what is the collection of love songs doing in the Hebrew Bible? Answer, I don't know. Answer, nobody knows. But the history of the answers, in fact, is an extremely interesting subject of discussion, which in fact has received a large number of books on the Jewish and Christian interpretation of the Song of Songs. In a nutshell, Jews and Christians alike, when they read the Song of Songs, they said, what are these erotic love songs doing in the Bible? There can only be one answer. Surely, it is a song about the love between God and his chosen people, between God and Israel, or between God and the church. So the male figure, of course, represents God, and the female figure represents the church or the synagogue or the people of Israel. On that fundamental insight, Jews and Christians from antiquity through the High Middle Ages were in complete unanimity. The only question was to figure out whether God is in love with his people Israel or whether God is in love with his church of Christians. On that subject, Jews and Christians, as you might suspect, disagreed, right, and have a great deal of argument and counter-argument. But the fundamental insight that the text is really about not physical love, but about spiritual love. And it's really about our love for God and God's love for us. It was a key point in ancient and medieval scriptural interpretation of this book. Whether that interpretation has any claim to being accurate, i.e., is that what the book is really about, or is this simply some secondary interpretation seized upon by pious readers who are otherwise shocked and offended by this book? Well, I don't know how to answer that question either, because how on earth do we know what the original intention of this book was, or more importantly, of the people who collected these love songs and then put them into the Bible? What were they thinking? It's not absurd to say that originally these may have been secular love songs, but the people who canonized them from the very beginning, from day one, they already understood these allegedly, nominally secular songs to be, quote, really songs about spiritual love, about the love of God for his people. And then this interpretive mode, this exegetical stance, becomes canonized in turn for later Jews and Christians. But one could argue it goes back to the very moment of canonization itself. We don't know. Yes, B.
Well, could you view it as just another kind of wisdom literature, how to lead a good life?
Yes, in fact, Jewish readers put it in the wisdom literature category. Again, King Solomon being an expert in all things wise, right? So he will have written the Book of Proverbs. He is allegedly will have written the Book of Ecclesiastes. More about that in the next lecture. So yes, it is sometimes put in that category when read in this allegorical, in this mode of spiritual love.
Well, I'm thinking of the non-allegorical reading, and this is an exemplar of how people can lead a very happy life.
That line of inquiry of interpretation has been taken by some modern scholars in our late 20th century, early 21st century, that is to say, who see the Song of Songs as sort of an antidote to the Garden of Eden story. That the Garden of Eden story, we have, quote, the fall, at least when read from a certain Christian perspective. We have the fall, which is inevitably associated with sin, sex, death. Right, that's the Garden of Eden story. Again, I'm not suggesting that's what the Garden of Eden story really is about. I'm simply saying that is how it has been read, and is still read in some circles, right? It has been read this way for a very long time. As an antidote to that, as it were, is a Song of Songs, which celebrates love, both physical love, physical union of male and female, right? And the joy of life and the joy of sex. And here there is no guilt, there is no sin, there is no death, right? There simply is an affirmation of life. So this is a modern reading, or perhaps a feminist reading, where also the scholars emphasize how the Song of Songs itself plays up love between equals. That is to say, there is no male dominant and female subordinate here. We, in fact, don't have domination of one over the other. We have two equal parties, one male, one female, who come together and joyously celebrate their union. So the Song of Songs has attracted this kind of reading. Needless to say, this is a modern, or maybe I shouldn't say needless to say. I'll take that back. This is a modern reading, a feminist reading, or a reading of sort of see the Song of Songs as counterpoint or antidote to the messages that are derived from the fall story in the Garden of Eden. So one can spend easily a whole session on the Song of Songs. In fact, one can spend an entire course on the Song of Songs, which I did once in a former institution, on the Song of Songs in Jewish and Christian spirituality and in Jewish and Christian exegesis. So this book remains really an intriguing book, and its seductiveness has not waned over the centuries. It is, in fact, a remarkable, and also a very beautiful book. It's just simply very beautiful poetry in the book. In the lecture notes, I've given you some brief summary and brief comments about some other books, which also, alas, we will need to skip over, simply by dint of insufficient number of sessions. So that's Ruth, Lamentations, Esther, Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah. When you go home after class is over, you should go read all these books, because they're certainly worth at least looking at. But frankly, I don't think they deserve a whole session each, the way the Song of Songs might. So that's the one I really regret, not having one more session, which would have been useful. But the other ones are certainly worth knowing something about, and you have some basic information on the lecture notes. So now I'd like to turn to the notion of wisdom literature, which makes up a large chunk of this third part of the Bible, the Hagiographer, or the sacred writings. Wisdom literature. Under this category, we include some of the Psalms, the Book of Proverbs, the Book of Job, and the Book of Ecclesiastes, also called Kohelet, and perhaps, as I mentioned, if you stretch things a little bit, Song of Songs, which I will not refer to further today. Book of Job and the Book of Ecclesiastes are extraordinary books, and they do deserve lots of attention, and we'll get that in our next lecture. Since Job and Ecclesiastes, or again, in Hebrew, Kohelet, right, are books which seem to reject the standardized teachings of wisdom tradition. They're working within the wisdom tradition, but they're anti-wisdom tradition. Whereas Proverbs and parts of the Psalms affirm it. So today we're going to look at the wisdom literature in general. What is it? What are the major ideas, major concepts of the wisdom tradition? And then we'll talk specifically about the Book of Proverbs, and then the Book of Psalms. So let's begin. Wisdom literature. The Hebrew word for wisdom is chokhmah, sometimes translated skill, or perhaps even technique in various passages, but conventionally a chacham is a sage or a wise person, and a chacham speaks chokhmah, wisdom. So these books are written by sages, and they spout wisdom. Wisdom tradition, namely sage advice from a sage person, often written in the genre of an old man instructing a young man, an old man at the end of his life and career, instructing a young man how to avoid all the mistakes that the old man made, right? Or something like that. This genre you find everywhere in the ancient world. It's hardly unique to ancient Israel. On the contrary, you find it in Greece, you find it in Mesopotamia, you find it in Egypt. And in fact, the international quality of wisdom literature is evidenced by the fact that there is a chunk in the Book of Proverbs, and I gave you the citation on the notes, where all modern scholars agree that this seems to be an Israelite version of a piece of an Egyptian wisdom book. Again, who's on first, who's on second, we can argue, but the simplest way to read it is the Egyptian book is earlier, and the Israelites took that Egyptian piece, took it into Hebrew, and Israelitified it. Turned it into Israelite wisdom literature, which simply shows that the advice involved, the beliefs, the values, social values embedded in these texts were pretty much international values. So that is confirmed too by the fact that as a rule, Israelite wisdom books are not Israelite. What do I mean? They're written in Hebrew, to be sure. They're in the Hebrew Bible, to be sure. But the number of references to quintessential Israelite practices, beliefs, history, institutions, the number is small. In fact, sometimes you can go for long stretches and not talk about the Torah, the temple, sacrifices, the Sabbath, any of the distinctive beliefs, any of the distinctive practices, any of the distinctive institutions. They are barely there, if there at all. Similarly, the name of God, not always, but in some of these texts, specifically in the book of Job and the book of Kohelet, Ecclesiastes, The name of God throughout is not the Tetragrammaton, not the YHWH, that God, that unique God of Israel, but rather it's Elohim, simply the deity. So again, this confirms his international focus, right? This is national literature on the one hand, but it's national literature which sees itself as part of a larger compass, a larger set of works. Again, the theme is advice, how to live a good life. And this, of course, would be a subject for sages all over the place in the ancient world. Okay, we're going to talk about standard or positive wisdom, it's been called. Kugel calls it Orthodox Wisdom, which I think is an anachronistic term, so I'm going to avoid that. Namely, these are the teachers in the Book of Proverbs and then in various Psalms who uphold traditional teachings, who uphold traditional values and traditional norms. The more exciting wisdom, of course, are those books which question received wisdom, which question received norms, or don't believe what you've been told. That's, of course, the book of Job and the book of Ecclesiastes. Job doesn't believe it for a minute, and Ecclesiastes doesn't think it does any good. So, but that's more exciting, and needless to say, attracts a lot more attention, especially the question about why the canonizers of the Hebrew Bible would include such interesting, provocative works in their collection. A question for which I have no real answer. But we'll come back to Job and Ecclesiastes next time. Today we're doing the more staid, more conventional, and dare I say it, more boring and predictable wisdom that we find encoded or enshrined in the Book of Proverbs, most of all. So, Book of Proverbs. What do we have in the Book of Proverbs? We have, after the introductory stuff in the first chapter, we have a long opening piece from chapter 1 through chapter 9, right, which sets out the theme: young man, pursue wisdom; young man, avoid folly, right? And wisdom is personified in a certain beautiful stretch as a female figure. I'm not sure if she's a woman or simply a female noun and a female figure, but folly is certainly personified as what shall we say, a woman of loose morals, right? And of course, you, young man, must assiduously avoid her or coming anywhere near her or entering her house, because disaster will ensue. That's the theme of again, so folly versus wisdom. That's the opening chapters, chapter 1 through 9. Then after that, we have a series of collections of proverbs. Many of these proverbs have a kind of folksy quality to them. They remind us of qualities that we find all over the world, from Iceland down to Africa. All cultures have these kind of folksy, homespun wisdom kind of proverbs, reflecting on the way of the world and giving sage advice to people if only they would heed it. In the Book of Proverbs, especially after chapter 9, when you get past this long section, then we have these collections of proverbs. So on the handout, I give you some samples of these folksy kinds of proverbs. Hatred stirs up strife, but love covers up all faults. Sounds like a fortune from a Chinese fortune cookie. As a dog returns to his vomit, so a dullard repeats his folly. A soft answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. That has a Benjamin Franklin quality to it, I think, or Poor Richard's Almanac. Like a gold ring in the snout of a pig is a beautiful woman bereft of sense. Politically incorrect, perhaps, but nonetheless a sentiment widely shared in the ancient world. A friend is devoted at all times. A brother is born to share adversity. And so on. These perhaps do or do not have great moral truth to them, but again, each is a freestanding sentence. They're not essays, they're not chapters, they're not paragraphs. They're sentences, one following the other. Often as not, the arrangement is just by a word that links one word to the next, or perhaps some sound, or it's hard to figure out a theme here. There is no theme. It's a collection of pithy proverbs to keep with you in your pocket, to keep you guided on this path of the straight and narrow. And if you heed this wisdom, well, we'll come to that back in 1 second. Heed this wisdom, everything will be fine. All will turn out well. Perhaps the most interesting verse of all in that long stretch after chapter 9, which seems to go on endlessly, of these Proverbs, is chapter 25, verse 1, one of the very few verses in the Hebrew Bible where the Bible gives us information about itself. And that's chapter 25, verse 1. These two are the Proverbs. Gam ele mishlei Shlomo. These two are the Proverbs of Solomon, which the men of King Hezekiah of Judah copied. So here we have a verse which tells us how the book of Proverbs, at least in part, was put together. That King Hezekiah, at his court, one of the things that the sages of the court did was to collect proverbs attributed to Solomon. And here we're told in chapter 25, verse 1, here's another collection of proverbs attributed to Solomon, put together by the men, presumably the courtiers, of King Hezekiah. Scholars have argued endlessly about the force of that verb, copied. We're not quite sure what that verb means. Maybe transferred, maybe compiled. It's tiku is the Hebrew word, meaning of which is not clear, which is too bad. But anyway, we can see clearly, though, that King Hezekiah, as king, saw to it, as part of his mandate as king, is to collect the Proverbs of Solomon. And ultimately, our book of Proverbs is a collection of collections. And at least some of those collections, it seems, go back to King Hezekiah. You remember King Hezekiah, don't you? He was one of the good kings in the book of Kings. Remember, Manasseh is the evil list of all the kings of Judah. Hezekiah and Josiah, these are the two heroes of the book of Kings, the good kings of Judah. So this is King Hezekiah, the same fellow who nearly escaped conquest by the Assyrians, you remember, when Isaiah came to him and assured him that all will be well, and he narrowly escaped, Judah narrowly escaped being conquered by the Assyrians. Another extraordinary story in the book of Kings. You remember that. That's this King Hezekiah. Okay, anyway, I don't know any other verse in the Hebrew Bible where the Bible tells us about how the Bible came to be, or how the biblical book came to be, unless it be sections of the book of Jeremiah. But this is an interesting verse, and it's interesting in its own right. Okay, let's continue. So, the book of Proverbs, wisdom literature, Israelite but international in flavor. We have those long opening chapters about folly and wisdom personified as women, and pursue the one, avoid the other. And then for the rest of the book, we have the string of kind of folksy, many of them homespun proverbs to teach you how to lead a good life or making observations about life. What is the takeaway from this? So here we have wisdom literature, here we have the book of Proverbs. Well, what do I learn from this? Or what is the point? The point is the wise prosper and the fools suffer. The wise person, by following wisdom, following sage counsel from the sage, and doing that which is wise or prudent or careful, taking advantage of good judgment, sensible judgment. The result of that mode of life is a good life. A life lived well is the good life. And well here understood means according to the canons of wisdom, propriety, virtue. So what is the reward of virtue? Answer, a virtuous life. The virtuous life is the good life. That's the reward. And what is the punishment for a life of folly? A life dedicated to not wisdom? The punishment is a life of folly. A life not filled with wisdom. That's your own punishment. In other words, the good man gets the good life, the good person gets the good life, and the fool gets a life frittered away, wasted. So, the wise has a happy, prosperous life, and the fool's life comes to ruin. What are the virtues inculcated in the book of Proverbs? The virtues are, or the vices are, greed, need to be self-controlled. The virtuous man also supports the poor. Charity is one of the virtues in the book of Proverbs. Proper speech. Don't speak too quickly. Don't say anything stupid or rash. Think before you speak, especially if you're in the presence of noblemen or the king. Right? Don't open your mouth and say something stupid. Right? Think carefully before you speak. The fool just goes and blabs, right, and just chats off endlessly. Diligence, labor, humility, avoidance of anger, self-control. These are the kinds of virtues and their opposite, the vices, that are discussed by the book of Proverbs. To be inculcated, to be inculcated, others, of course, to be avoided. So, this sounds very much like a Poor Richard's Almanac type of piety, namely that the good man has the good life. I keep saying man because these texts do, but you understand, I mean the good person. The good person gets the good life, and the fool does not. Now, what's the role of God in all this? There is a clear strand in the book of Proverbs in which God is barely mentioned, in the sense that the virtue, the reward of virtue is virtue, and the reward of folly is folly. And that's just the way things are. These are the way it happens automatically, it happens inevitably. So if you believe that right living is its own reward, an ethical life is a life of ethics and consequently a good life, well then I don't need to have God into this calculus, because this is simply the way things happen. And that certainly is a strong message of many sections of the book of Proverbs in this wisdom literature. So on the handout I have some passages like that. Better is little with righteousness than a large income with injustice. The righteousness of the blameless man smooths his way, but the wicked man is felled by his wickedness. He who digs a pit will fall into it, and whoever rolls a stone, it will roll back on him. This is simply the way the world works, according to these wisdom teachers. So what does the good life mean? The good life presumably means that you will live long, be happy, one assumes be prosperous also, just as a life of folly produces the opposite, the unhappy life. The ungood life is the consequence of folly. Part of a good life is children. Part of a good life means that your name will live on. It's a common motif in this literature. Your name will live on, presumably through your children and grandchildren. And indeed, that is the ultimate reward, is to live into old age, be surrounded by your children and grandchildren. And what greater reward can there be? But that's what awaits the life of the virtuous person, often in these texts, both in Proverbs and also in the book of Psalms. Now, there's nothing wrong with what I just said from a perspective of traditional Israelite piety, but except that traditional Israelite piety does want to throw God into this mix. We want somehow to be the ultimate authority standing behind this system, right? There should be a checks and balances system here, or somebody keeping an eye on the books to make sure that the good get rewarded and the evil, the foolish, the knave, right, gets punished. Where's my guarantor that that's going to work that way? Well, traditional wisdom literature, as often expressed in the book of Proverbs, seems to be saying that this is simply how the world works. That is to say, trust me on this, says the sage to the young man, right? You pursue virtue and you avoid vice, you will have a long, happy, and prosperous life. We know that this is so, says the sage. Well, for the theists among ancient Israel, after all, weren't most of them theists, they would add to that statement, well, I need to explain a little bit more that the virtuous man gets the virtuous life because God wills it so, or God sees to it that it is so, or God is the guarantor, the ultimate guarantor that righteousness will triumph. God is the ultimate guarantor that the virtuous man will in fact have the good life, just as God is the guarantor that the fool, or to be a little more, turn up the heat a little bit, the evil man will not have the good life, or will somehow, somewhere, get punished for his deeds. Proverbs does not dwell on this, but it's very clear, though, that our book of Proverbs is already somewhat been theized, if I can use that word, in which the ancient Israelites take these fundamental wisdom ideas, right, and then try very hard to put it into the framework of a traditional belief of a providential God, namely a God who rewards and punishes. It's not spelled out the way the prophets do. That's what the prophets emphasize. The prophets emphasize how God rewards and punishes, how God keeps the books. The book of Proverbs simply affirms that this traditional wisdom teaching, namely that virtue is rewarded and folly is punished, that this fits very nicely into a traditional theistic scheme. And this you can see throughout the book of Proverbs in various passages here and there, beginning in chapter 1, verse 7, right there on your handout. The beginning of wisdom is fear of the Lord. Right, in which we could see these two conceptions are married. These two conceptions are brought together, and the one supports the other. So that wisdom notions of virtue, in fact, reinforce the idea that you are to follow the commandments or fear of the Lord, and the fear of the Lord is the ultimate guarantor that wisdom notions will, in fact, turn out to be true. We moderns who are deist types, like the wisdom literature without the God part, right? As if somehow by automatic automaton, the world just works this way, that the goodness is rewarded because the reward of a good life is a good life, and the reward of the punishment of a bad life is a bad life. We'd like to think that we're true. And we're not sure about to do with this God stuff, many of us, so we're happy with the wisdom traditions. But the book of Proverbs, as you can see already, is trying to get God into this equation. As I said, the ultimate guarantor that it's going to work. But as we see in the prophets, you recall our discussion of the prophets, there was vigorous discussion in ancient Israel about how did God really do this and how does God really make things work. The prophets were much exercised by this. But wisdom is a different voice in that chorus. And next lecture we'll come back to that theme of Job and Ecclesiastes, which question this traditional wisdom which I've just described. Now we're going to talk about the other main book of the Ketuvim, and that's the book of Psalms. Psalms is the Greek name for the book. It literally comes from the verb to pluck, because you're plucking strings on a harp. So these are songs, we might translate that. In Hebrew it's called Tehillim, which literally means praises, songs of praise. Tehillah is a singular, Tehillim plural. We are praising God. And that's the first important point about the book of Psalms. The entire book is about God. There is not a psalm in the book in which God is not the main character. It's either to God or it's about God. These are songs of praise to or about God, although praise understood loosely, as we'll see in a second. The traditional view is that King David, father of the aforementioned King Solomon, right? King David is the author, quote unquote, of the book of Psalms. And in fact, sometimes ancient Jews and Christians alike refer to the book of Psalms as the book of David, or simply David. A fair number of the Psalms bear the inscription to David, in Hebrew, Le David, although as modern scholars emphasize, there's some ambiguity in what that means, to say to David. Does this mean by David, or does it mean about David, or does it mean perhaps in the spirit of or inspired by David? Not quite clear whether, in fact, we should read these as signs of authorship or not. In any case, you don't need to be a modern Bible scholar to notice that there are any number of Psalms in the Book of Psalms which could not have been written by King David. And modern scholars emphasize that we have in this anthology of songs or poems, we have a wide range, not only of genres, but a wide range of dates. So some are very, quote, early, quote unquote, and what everybody's favorite candidate for that is Psalm 29, which is discussed by Kugel, which Psalm 29, Havul Adonai b'nei Elim, Havul Adonai kavod va'oz, sing unto the Lord b'nei Elim, sons of the mighty ones, sons of God, sons of the gods. I'm not quite sure how to translate that. Right? The imagery of Psalm 29 comes straight out of Ugaritic poetry written up in what's now Lebanon or the Syrian coast region, which seems to take hymns that are originally describing Baal and are transferred and translated to describe the God of Israel. Nothing wrong with that, except that the imagery comes from poetry that we assume is at least 1,000 years older than King David, or several hundred years older than King David. That would be Psalm 29. On the other hand, we have Psalm 137. By the rivers of Babylon we sat and wept as we remembered Zion. Clearly a reference to the exile of 587 or maybe 597 BCE. And some modern scholars have argued there are even later psalms in the book, perhaps down into Hellenistic times. Hellenistic times, remember, 4th, 3rd, 2nd centuries BC. So we all agree that King David traditionally had a major formative role in the emergence of this collection of psalms. Perhaps, for all we know, he actually wrote some psalms, right? This we don't know, but our collection as we have it is not by King David. In fact, it is a broad collection spanning centuries of ancient Israelite poetry writing. Okay, more important than that. Okay, so it's not by King David, but it's some of them were inspired perhaps by King David, wide range of dates. Okay, very nice. More importantly, for our purposes, as usual, is what's the book about? All right, so Psalms can be broadly classified into two broad categories, and each of these categories, in turn, has numerous subtypes. What are the two main types? They are thank you and please. These are the two main types. So, thank you, these are hymns of praise. God, you are wondrous and powerful. God, we love you. God, we yearn to be in your presence. We yearn to sit and dwell in your temple. The righteous man is the man who is blessed by God. And so on, which these are hymns of praise, which I would say fundamentally are thank you, but some of them are not so coarse as to be thank you. We love God. More interesting ones are the please psalms. The please psalms, again, have a wide range of types. Some of them are things like, God, grant victory to our king. Or, God, I'm really in a terrible way, I need your help. Sometimes strengthened by things like, my enemies mock me. And where are you, O God? Why aren't you saving me when I need you? That could be either in the plural or the singular. Or, the nations round about have attacked us and mocked us, and they belittle you, O God. Surely you need to come to defend your own reputation. Not just me. It's you we're worried about. So there's a wide range of types, but fundamentally we see the hymns of praise, or thank you types, as well as the please types. And many modern scholars have propounded a wide variety of types, right? Arguing that behind these literary distinctions of genre are also religious or social distinctions of social location. Are they in the temple? Are they in the court? Are they in the village? Who is singing? For whom? Under what occasion? You know, the way modern Bible scholars do, they create castles in the air. So let's look briefly at a couple of these just to get a sense of what we find in the Book of Psalms. So let's go first talk about the hymns of praise, what I was calling loosely before, thank you. But they're not necessarily thank you. They're just often, we love God, is often the theme of these Psalms. The most impressive thing, especially for us moderns, is to see in the Book of Psalms, in these Psalms, this overwhelming sense of love of God, this overwhelming sense of trust in God, this overwhelming sense of God's reality, God's presence. Not just in the cult, in the temple, and the sacrifices, but in life. That for the psalmist, God's presence is real, and God's presence is near, and God's love, and the psalmist's love for God is evident. That's just very striking to see. And these qualities explain why later Jews and Christians alike loved the Book of Psalms, because they found in it expressions of this deepest spiritual yearnings. So I've given you on your handout two specimens of this type. One is Psalm 23, the other is Psalm 146. Psalm 23 is by far, I think, the single most famous, most widely recited, most beloved psalm, beloved of both Jews and Christians alike, recited at various occasions, in which we can, the psalmist's love of God and trust in God is just palpable and it's wonderful. So you have it for you in the King James Version, which is the only version you're allowed to read in English. You're not allowed to read that psalm in any other. That's the one we all know, is Psalm 23 in English. The Hebrew is, if you want to hear a little bit of Hebrew, Mizmor David, Adonai Ro'i lo achsar, Benot Desha yar bitzeni, Almei menuchot yinahaleni. Nafshi yeshovev, yancheni b'maglei tzedek leman shmo. Gam ki elech begeit salmavet, lo ira ra ki ata imadi. Shiftecha umish antecha, hema yinachamuni. Taroch lefanai shulchan neged sorarai. V'yishanta b'shemen roshi, kosi revaya. Ach tov v'chesed yerdefuni kol yemei chayai. V'shavti b'veit Adonai le'orech yamim. That is Psalm 23. As Kugel discusses at some length, the English translation familiar to us all, or familiar to all of us who have ever heard the Psalms, of the King James is probably wrong, philologically speaking. There are some obscure cryptic phrases which Hebrew philology has advanced since the 17th century, so we are now fairly convinced that we understand the phrases a lot better than they did. But that's no matter. Who of us would want to give up the idea of, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death? Who would want to give that phrase up? I would not. I think English language would be impoverished, right, if we were to admit that that translation is simply wrong. Doesn't matter. Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. It's beautiful. That's Psalm 23. Or Psalm 146 is another one which is a little bit longer, so I will not recite it. But you have it before you on the handout, again, where the psalmist is convinced that the Lord exercises benevolent, providential concern for the world. And all is right. Every day is sunny. Everything is fine. The righteous prosper. The wicked do not. God is king and wonderful. Beautiful. That's Psalm 146. On the other hand, Psalms of Lament, as modern scholars call them, often are endowed with deep pathos, that you can feel the pain of the psalmist. Not just pain, but deep disappointment. That on the one hand, you have this confidence and faith and trust in God. But on the other hand, why is my situation so terrible? Why am I suffering so? Aren't you a righteous God? Where are you, God? And the pathos in these psalms are really palpable. And some of them are quite dramatic. These can be either in the plural, referring to somebody singing about the catastrophes that have befallen the people of Israel, notably the destruction of the temple, notably the exile, or some other catastrophe. Or it could be personal, in which the person sings about her perhaps, own catastrophes and disasters and wondering where God is to help me out when I need him most. Why don't I see him? Why isn't God manifesting himself? So I've given you on your handout a couple of examples of these, notably Psalm 79, in which the psalmist argues that God needs to protect his own reputation. That is to say, the impotence of the people of Israel not only is bad for Israel, but makes God look bad. Because the nations round about will think that Israelite God is an impotent God. And that can't be good. Surely, God, you should manifest your power for your own sake, so people won't say bad things about you. That's an argument that appears elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible, but it gets good expression in Psalm 79. The Book of Psalms ultimately became or maybe I should say, the prayer book for ancient Jews and also ancient Christians. And following them, as Judaism and Christianity emerged, this becomes one of the most beloved books for both Jews and Christians alike. And it is recited regularly in the liturgy of both the synagogue and the church to this very day. We can see the beginning of that process in the Bible itself. There are two good examples in the Bible where a character in a story sort of stops the action, opens the mouth, and out comes a psalm. Not exactly one of the psalms we have in our collection of psalms, but something very similar to what we have in our collection of psalms, so we may call it a psalm-like text, is what the narrator puts into the mouth of a character. And here we can see already from the point of view of the narrator is showing us how these psalms were used in private devotional worship. So one of them is the story of Hannah, and I give it to you on the handout, the mother of Samuel in 1 Samuel 2. You will recall here we have the barren matriarch motif once again, right? Samuel's mother Hannah, alas, is one of two wives. The husband loves her more, but of course it's the other wife who produces all the sons. So the barren matriarch, of course, feels worthless. In that society and culture, a woman needs to produce a son in order to feel validated. So she comes to the sanctuary and she pours her heart out before God, which she is yearning for a son. Finally, she gets a son. She brings the son back, and she had made a deal with God. You give me a son, I'll give him to you. And that's how the prophet Samuel grows up at the shrine of Shiloh, in Shiloh, English Shiloh, Hebrew Shiloh. So the narrator in chapter 2 of the book of Samuel has the mother of Samuel, Hannah, come to the shrine, present her son, and then she opens her mouth and gives a song, which a song of praise and thanks to God. At last, she has her son. Now, what does she say when she opens her mouth? Does she say, "Thank you, God, for giving me a son"? Well, yeah, she sort of says that, but it's interesting to see how this little text functions, right? She begins with, "My heart exults in the Lord." This is on your handout. "My heart exults in the Lord. I have triumphed through the Lord. I gloat over my enemies." Hannah, what enemies? You didn't have any enemies. You were childless. That's always your problem. Shh. "I gloat over my enemies. I rejoice in your deliverance. There is no Holy One like the Lord. There's no one beside you. There's no rock like our God. Talk no more with lofty pride. Let no arrogance cross your lips. For the Lord is an all-knowing God." Okay, we'll skip a little bit. "The bows of the mighty are broken, and the faltering are girded with strength." I'm going to skip to the end to save a little bit of time. He is good to the faithful, right? The wicked will perish. Not by strength shall man prevail. The foes of the Lord shall be shattered. He will thunder against them in the heavens. The Lord will judge the ends of the earth. He will give power to his king and triumph to his anointed one. At which point we may want to say to Hannah, Hannah, you must have picked up the wrong prayer because you wanted the prayer of thanksgiving on the birth of his son, and instead you picked up the psalm, which is a prayer for victory for the king. That's why he's got enemies and foes who are laid low and the triumph of the king, that you got the wrong psalm, Hannah. The answer, of course, is she picked up the right psalm. As many scholars have noticed, including Kugel in your reading, right, the Psalms, while they often celebrate victory or bewail disaster, are always written in a general enough tone so that almost anyone in almost any situation can find himself in the text, or can find me and myself in the text. So here Hannah, mother of Samuel, according to the 1 Samuel chapter 2, recites this psalm. The psalm is not exactly about the psalm of a barren woman who has been blessed with the birth of a child. It seems to be a reference to a psalm of victory for a king, triumphing over his enemies, but it does have one line in the middle of it, which is very relevant to Hannah's situation, or could be thought to be relevant to her situation. While the barren woman bears 7, the mother of many is forlorn. The Lord deals death and gives life. So presumably Hannah herself, or maybe I should say the narrator of the book of Samuel, says, yes, because that line, which refers to about the barren woman, well, she was barren. Therefore, this psalm is completely appropriate to the kind of thing a barren woman might have said, or perhaps for all we know, did say, when she came to the central shrine to celebrate the birth of a child after years of barrenness. In other words, these texts are very elastic. These psalm texts are all vague enough, or are studded with images of all kinds, one upon the other, that ancients could pick up almost any psalm and somehow find in it resonance, find their own situation resonating with what's written in the text. And that is one of the secrets of the book of Psalms. Not only is their heartfelt spirituality, but is their vagueness, which allows them to be used in a wide variety of situations. So to conclude on that last point, pious Jews and Christians alike really don't care about the different genres and types of psalms that are proposed by modern Bible scholars. They don't really care about the original author. They don't really care about the original setting. They don't really care about how the psalm came to be, or how the book of Psalms got collected, or the various strata in the book of Psalms, or in fact the historical circumstances of the Psalms, right? All of that is interesting, but ultimately irrelevant. For the Bible scholar, these questions are of immense importance, but for living Jews and Christians, i.e. people living in a spiritual environment, the power of the book of Psalms is not any of those things. The power of the book of Psalms is the imagery and the intensity that the author is invested in these texts, such that Jews and Christians to this day find meaning and a sense of fulfillment reading these texts. That's the book of Psalms.
Okay. One thought I had while you're gathering yours is quoting, he cites 2 examples here. There's others, but Hannah, the mother of Samuel, in her piece, and then Jonah in the belly of the whale. And it struck me that you see a similar pattern in the New Testament, particularly in Luke, where you have Mary's song, the Magnificat, which in some ways sounds a lot like a Hannah song. Then you have Zechariah's song, you have the angels singing. I've often said Luke was like the first musical. You know, people do some stuff, they stop and sing, they do some stuff, they stop and sing. So it's kind of like a musical. So I think that one way that this, when they wrote, when Luke, the author of Luke wrote, I think one of the things he was doing was probably doing something that was familiar to his readers already, having read this in their own scriptures. They would have been familiar with this pattern of text. The other thing is he was talking about the elasticity of the Psalms, and again, I would go back to the 23rd Psalm. It's probably the one piece of scripture that probably most people, even if they're unchurched, probably know. I suspect if they've gone to like more than 2 funerals, you've heard it. And I guess there's some question, is it appropriate for a funeral, because it mentions death once, but it is, I guess there's probably a good 99 to 100% chance you'll hear it read at a funeral, the next funeral you go to. And so, and I guess, so are there any thoughts?
And when you said, that the Psalms there were elastic or vague, that anybody can find themselves in them, I mean, I see that in, but it also, this might sound bad, but it also reminds me of horoscopes, in the sense that you read somebody's horoscope and you can apply it to anybody if you don't tell them what month it is. We've not, we've played that trick on people before, But I hadn't thought of them being that elastic before, but I guess they are.
Yeah, I'm not sure that's a pejorative way he's describing it. I think
I know that's not a good analogy, but I just
but because I think to me, I think great art. One of the things that makes a piece of art great is we can see some meaning that relates to us.
Yeah. I like your connection to Luke, with Mary's song and stuff. That's interesting. Yeah.
Carol?
To go back to the Book of Proverbs, he emphasized how the good people have a good life and those who are fools have a bad life. He didn't really emphasize the fact that that's not necessarily true.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And that's
although that does come out in the Book of Job and so forth.
right. Yeah, that's one of his points, is that Job and Ecclesiastes will challenge that that notion.
Yeah.
Saving his punchline for next week.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the way we would like it to be, Carol, right? But that's not necessarily true.
I agree. And I think that's why some of the Psalms of Lament, I think of the 22nd Psalm, that we always hear on Good Friday, is, my God, why have you forsaken me? I mean, that's something, if I were to pick a Psalm of Lament, that's probably to me the best example of any Psalm of Lament.
Mhm.
Yeah, he didn't mention that. Yeah.
Is anybody else getting a lot of thunder? We're getting
Yes,
huge
yes.
Oh,
thunder and raining, the dog's going nuts.
no,
The storm is with us.
no, it hasn't got to us yet.
No, we had it hours ago.
Oh,
There's tornado watch in Torrington. Torrington.
Mhm.
Yeah. I think that's what David got a couple of hours ago, is now coming east.
Yeah, maybe.
I think it's past Torrington now.
Okay.
did you have a tornado watch, David?
No, I don't remember us having one of those, but we did have thunderstorms.
I think it's interesting that with the Psalms, that's the one piece that we always have in our Sunday morning worship.
Mhm.
Mhm.
It's also the consistent one you have in the morning prayers, in the the daily offices. You
Yeah,
probably know this better than I do, Carol. But there's always a psalm, and somebody told me once that if you actually do all of the offices on schedule, you have gone through the whole book of Psalms
Mhm.
within a pretty short time. Am I right?
Yes, I think that's true. We did the office like morning and evening. We didn't do all the sections of the
Oh,
book of Psalms, and but yes,
they didn't rouse you out at 3 a.m.
yeah. The monks did it all. They got up even during the night to do it. So
Yeah, I had one of my colleagues at the college did a retreat during Christmas vacation at a monastery, and he thought it'd be relaxing, but he found it very stressful.
getting up so much.
Yeah, he was like every there's 5 of them, I think, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So, but I think the core of those, and I know we do the morning prayer on Mondays and Fridays, but the core is always, you begin with the psalm, and then there's usually some reading that's been picked.
Mhm.
But
One of the things that I don't think he mentioned, but that well, Luther read all of the Psalms from the point of Jesus. Whatever the psalm was, whether it's a lament or not,
yeah,
but they were all read through Jesus.
As if Jesus were speaking the psalm, praying the psalm.
Yeah. Or that it was about Jesus, that every psalm is about Jesus.
Okay.
I think that's stretching it.
yeah.
I'm just saying what Luther did.
Well, I think that that really emphasizes Cohen's last point, that for Christians and Jews, the context and all of the other modern Bible scholar stuff really is irrelevant. So, and I think Luther was really always focused on, reading Jesus into Scripture.
Is there a context? I mean, to some extent, you're saying that the Psalms really are very, what was his term, very elastic.
Mhm.
I've always sort of been left flat because they're very pretty, but I always thought, where do they come from? Where's the context? Maybe it doesn't matter. I mean, somebody wrote it thinking of something specific, and I thought.
Yeah.
And some of them you can read it. If some of them you can tell what the specific is.
yeah.
The ones that are grouped for praise of the king,
Mhm.
you can tell which ones are doing that. And then the lament, you can tell which ones are lament. And when you look at one of those, you can imagine them in Babylon using them as they were crying and over their disaster.
Whatever that was.
Yeah.
Yeah, I had Psalm 71 open. I mean, the title just says prayer for lifelong protection and help. That could apply to anybody in a lot of circumstances.
Mhm.
And that's why I was saying they were sort of vague. And yet they're very true.
But I think it's like they are poetry. So I think if you look at it, and I've always looked at them as poetry, that then they do, they may have been written about a specific circumstance, but the poem may have been a poet's response. Like, for instance, a guy I know wrote a poem responding to Chartres Cathedral. And it's a great poem, but the point is, it was his response, but to the sacred space. But then I think somebody else could read it, maybe and see their response to another sacred space, be it Chartres or Notre Dame or St. Luke.
Yeah.
So I guess the question, it's like with any poetry, is it important for us to know the thing that prompted that poem, the specifics, or is it, we look for the meaning there? And I'm not sure. I guess it probably depends on where you are at a certain point.
Yeah. Well, I went back to Psalm 23. The title for that is The Divine Shepherd. So that's, like, that's probably why you hear it at funerals in general,
Mhm.
Yes.
I'd like to know what he said. It was a mistranslation. That worries me.
Well, if you look
I
at some of
memorized it.
if you look at some of the different translations, it doesn't say shadow of death, valley of shadow of death. I've seen a different translation.
Yeah, and then one of the things I said, read that actually the Valley of the Shadow of Death was at least for the writer, they theorized it may have been the Kidron Valley, a real place.
Yeah. Well, see, this is the NRSV, okay, and it says, even though I walk through the darkest valley, I fear no evil. It doesn't mention that. So, in darkest valley, there could be bad times. It could be death.
Mhm.
It's kind of broader than just death, but troubling times.
Folks, please forgive. I must leave. I'm going to have a late supper.
Oh,
So,
okay.
all right. Good night.
Good night, Dale.
And yeah, or it says, and it has a footnote that says, or the valley of the shadow of death. And the footnote.
Mhm. So the other thing on the importance of the Psalms is that if you go to museums much or old libraries, some of the earliest books and the earliest like manuscripts were of the Psalms or Psalters. And, and some of them were gorgeous. They have all these paintings and stuff in them, but they, that was the thing that they reproduced first.
Nice.
And that was really the thing people carried with them, for instance.
So they're short and like you said, they're like a poem or a song, so it's easy to remember.
Mhm.
The prayers.
Did anybody have any thoughts on what he said generally about Proverbs other than Carol or wisdom literature or Song of Songs?
Yeah. Oh.
A lot of people have bent over backwards trying to explain why those things are in the Bible. What they tell you in seminary, Mary?
I wasn't told anything.
Oh. So that's always good if you want to get people to look for the racy parts.
Yeah.
And then I remember one time we did try to do in another church. I was asked by one of the church members, so we did a study on the Book of Proverbs, and it's rather difficult because it's basically one saying after another with no real connective tissue, so to speak.
Yeah.
I was up in Brooklyn there.
Yeah.
Well, forgive me, but I'm going to leave the meeting. Have a
Okay.
good night, everyone.
Good night. We'll see you next week. So we will reconvene next week and then we'll have our summer vacation.
Okay.
Good night.
All right.
Good night, Doug.
Everybody.
All right.